So I'm going to share a story about how a board that had heard this kind of conversation stepped into it. This was a board of really reluctant people who did not want to have to raise money. And so I was brought in to teach their board how to ask for major gifts, and they went, no, we're not doing that. In fact, I showed up at this board meeting and started doing my training, and they just went, we're not doing that, Susan. And so we had to back off and figure out what they could do. So I'm going to give you a list of 9 steps that they went through, and maybe you can extrapolate some of these steps to your own board or your own organization. So the very first thing we did was give each board member 2 donors who had given $500 or more in the last year, and ask them to simply call them and thank them for their past support. And when I asked people to do that, they said, no, we're not going to do that. That's too scary. And I said, why is that too scary? And they said, we don't know these people. They might ask us a question that we don't know the answer to, and it just feels too intrusive. And I said, well, what if you called them when you knew they weren't going to be there and left a voicemail? And they said, yes, we can do that. So we gave every board member the names of 2 people with a little bit of background on them about how they'd been connected to the organization over years, and said, here's the script. Read this into their answering machine. Here's the time when we think they're not going to be there. And what happened was they all dutifully go home and start dialing these numbers. And a couple of people answered the phone. Actually, most of them answered the phone. This was in the old days. And the board members couldn't believe that they were actually happy to hear from them, that the donors were thrilled that a board member was calling them, that they were important enough to get a call from the governors of the organization. And so, and the people started talking animatedly about how much they loved the organization. So the board members came back to the next meeting and they said, you know, that wasn't so bad. If we were going to do one more thing with these 2 people, what would that look like? So the second thing we had them do was take an email that the executive director created about where the best wildflowers were in the meadows, in the mountains at that moment, because she got trip reports from people. So she created a little teeny email that said, if you're going hiking this weekend, here are 3 fabulous trails with wildflowers in the meadows right now. And she sent that to the board, and all they had to do was push forward and send it to their same 2 donors. And they thought that they were going to be done at that point, but the donors actually wrote back and said, wow, this is really value added. I couldn't have gotten this information anywhere else. So thank you so much for sharing it. And it started a conversation. The third thing we had them do was invite those people on a hike that was only the top staff, a few board members, and a couple of major donors. And so they got to have this private, exclusive experience of the mission with these insiders. And they had a great time. But the people who couldn't go because it was August and they were busy ended up saying, if you do that again, would you please include me, because it sounds really great. The next thing we did was create a 1-pager that said this at the top. When you gave us money, you didn't know whose lives you were going to touch. But here are 3 stories to show you what your gift looked like when it hit the trail. And so we had 3 little stories that were just a paragraph long, and showing people what difference their support had made. And the board members folded up that little flyer, wrote a handwritten note on it, and stuck it in the mail, first-class mail. So the donors were getting a very personalized story of impact of what their gifts had done in the mail. The next month, we decided to invite them to a reception. This was a hiking organization, and we have the REI headquarters here, which is an outdoor equipment store, and they had a beautiful room up on the top with a great view of the mountains. And so we invited people to come to this reception at REI and meet a famous author who was a very famous photographer of wilderness areas before his next book had come out. And so the board members called their same 2 donors, and they said, if you show up at REI on Thursday between 4 and 5, we'll pour you a beer or a glass of wine, and you can hang out with this famous photographer and see the slides from his next book before it comes out. And so they all came to that. They had a really good time. They said it was the least favorite of their touch points in the long run, because it turns out they were all introverts and they didn't know how to work the room. So they said, at least I got to wear REI clothes instead of getting dressed up, and at least you let me drink beer. So it turned out to be okay for them. The next month, we found a really cool article in an insider trade magazine that the executive director subscribed to, but that most people wouldn't have seen. And we thought that article was really would be interesting to our top donors. And so we sent 2 copies to every board member and said, why don't you highlight the things about this article that you think your donors would be interested in, and stick it in a first-class envelope and send it to them by mail. And so I want you to see that these touch points were all different: snail mail, email, voicemail, in person, switch it around, mix it up. So it wasn't predictable like an e-newsletter is. People didn't know what was coming. And they were all things that cost no money and took no time. We made it really easy for board members by giving them the envelope, giving them the address, giving them the stamp, giving them the words to use, and so on. The next month was the legislative session, and so we had the person who was responsible for our legislative activity write a little one-pager on what were the major bills that were going to come up in the legislature, what position was Washington Trails going to take on those bills, and said, if you want to go with us to the state capitol, feel free to let me know, or if you want more information on these bills, let me know. Otherwise, feel free to delete this message. But what happened was that all of those donors emailed back and said, wow, send me more information like this. This is great. So the board members are like, really? You want to hear from me more? And they said, yeah, this is good. So the board members started to get more assertive about it. And the next month, there was a conference that they were putting on called Trails Fest. And there was an important speaker coming in from out of town to keynote. And so the board members called their same 2 donors and said, why don't you invite them to have a drink with the keynote speaker after the conference is over, and we'll buy. So the board members said that this was actually more fun than the reception for them, because they didn't have to talk very much. The keynote speaker was doing most of the talking while they had drinks. And then the last thing was that the board members got really excited about doing a trails project with the donors. And so they created this event where they all went to the mountains and shoveled rocks together on a trail in the woods together. And they said it was really nice because it was a level playing field. You couldn't tell who was a board member, who was a donor, doing the work of the organization together. And they all had a really great time. There was one person who couldn't participate in the trail project, but she came up in the afternoon with ice cream for everyone. So everyone got to participate. And at the end of the trails project, the board members came to us and they said, you know, we're ready to ask these people for money. And I said, you know, I tried to get you to do that 9 months ago and you threw daggers at me. So what's the difference? And what do you think the board members said? They said, we know them now. We have a relationship with these people. We know that they're connected to the mission. We know what part of the mission they're excited about. And we know that every single time we've been in touch with them over the year, it's been a value add to them that they couldn't buy or get anywhere else. It was something really personal, really tailored and insidery. So they said, we're really ready to ask these people for money, show us how. And what ended up happening was that it turned into really organic conversations with these people while they were walking around a lake or just having a beer or something. It wasn't a fraught, scary experience for them. And I think our board members need to understand that they're not actually asking people to contribute to the organization. What they're asking people to do is express what their dreams are for the future, what they want their community to look like through you. And I think that's a really important distinction. I hope that you'll remember that quote. It's also in the book. And help your board members understand that we're not begging, we're not asking people to support us so that we can pay our staff. We're asking them to bring their dreams to life through us.